At the edge of human perception, the night sky appears calm, a dark dome pricked with steady points of light. Yet in this apparent stillness, a story is unfolding that no previous generation could have sensed. High above the warmth and turbulence of the atmosphere, the James Webb Space Telescope holds its silent position. Near the gravitational balance point far from Earth, a metal flower of gold-coated mirrors unfolded toward the constellation Leo. Photons that have traveled for 124 light years slide across its optics, faint and thinned by distance, but still carrying the imprint of a small world that repeatedly passes in front of a dim red star. Each transit looks at first glance like a routine event in an ordinary system. A planet moves across the face of its star, the star dims by a tiny fraction, and instruments measure a delicate drop in brightness. This has been seen hundreds of times now, a familiar signature in the era of exoplanet discovery. Yet buried in these particular transits is something that refuses to behave like the others, a set of lines in the spectrum that hints at processes far beyond simple rock, gas, and ice. During every crossing, a thin halo of the planet's atmosphere filters the starlight before it reaches the telescope. That light is separated into colors by the spectrographs on board instruments built to turn brightness into information. Some wavelengths arrive slightly weaker, carved away by molecules high in the alien sky. Each missing shade marks a bond between atoms, a pattern that can be matched to gases measured in laboratories on Earth. Methane leaves its familiar marks, so does carbon dioxide, and water vapor traces soft, rounded features in the infrared. For dozens of worlds, these signals have formed a quiet catalog of atmospheres, an emerging census of what is possible around distant suns. But when this ocean world in Leo steps across its star, the pattern does not stop at the known gases. A cluster of features appears where no one expected them, a subtle but persistent dip at wavelengths that on Earth belong to fragile sulfur-bearing molecules whose strongest sources are living cells in the sea. The first time the data is processed, the strange absorption features could still be a glitch, a remnant of instrumental noise, or a quirk of the star itself. Teams run their calibrations again, strip away background, correct for temperature drifts in the detectors, and compare against observations of other planets taken in the same observing run. The unfamiliar pattern remains. The second time, a different instrument on the same telescope, tuned to overlapping wavelengths, watches another transit and returns the same quiet insistence in the graph. The probability that randomly fluctuating noise would mimic this specific combination of dips shrinks to a fraction of a percent. In statistical language, it rises to what researchers call 3 sigma significance, a level where chance is unlikely but caution is still mandatory. The graph alone does not say what the molecules are, only that something with a particular spectral fingerprint is present at startling abundance high above a world that may be covered in water. In an office lit by screens rather than windows, modelers begin to feed the numbers into atmospheric codes. They tell their simulations about a small star cooler and dimmer than the sun, about a planet a little more than twice the size of Earth, orbiting close enough to complete a year in a little over 1 month, about a thick envelope of hydrogen laced with methane and carbon dioxide. Then they add, almost experimentally, the spectra of dimethyl sulfide and its cousin dimethyl disulfide compounds known on Earth from the breath of phytoplankton and from the scent that rises off a living sea. The model spectra, when combined with what is already known from earlier telescopes, fall into place against the Webb data with unnerving precision. The depth and spacing of the mysterious dips are matched not in a vague way, but line by line. as though the atmosphere itself has written the same chemical script that the oceans of Earth learned long ago. Outside those simulations, the wider sky remains indifferent. The red dwarf in Leo continues to burn at a steady, cool temperature, throwing out flares now and then into the surrounding darkness. The planet continues its 33-day orbit, bound by gravity and invisible to human eyes. Nothing in that system changes just because instruments here have grown sensitive enough to interpret its light, yet from the human point of view, a threshold has quietly been crossed. For the first time in the short history of exoplanet science, there exists a remote atmosphere whose best explanation involves chemistry that on Earth appears only in the presence of life. It is not proof and not a declaration, only a probability that now leans toward biology more readily than toward stone magma or random chance. In quiet control rooms and late-night offices, minds turn this single clue over and over, tracing its implications, wondering how far the chain of inference can stretch before it fails. The story that begins here is not one of sudden revelation, but of slow accumulation, as if the universe has allowed a single faint signal to rise above the noise, inviting careful thought to follow it inward toward stranger questions that wait untouched in the dark. The road toward the strange sulfur signal stretches back through years of practice in reading tiny changes in starlight. Later observers learn to watch for transits, brief and regular dips in brightness when a planet passes in front of its star. From the depth of the dip size could be estimated, and from its rhythm the length of the year could be known. That was enough to reveal that small worlds are common and that many cling close to faint red suns, but it could not say what those worlds are made of. To move beyond silhouettes, astronomers had to see the effect of a planet's atmosphere on the light of its star. During a transit, a narrow ring of air encircles the planet from the telescope's point of view. A tiny fraction of starlight skims through this ring before continuing into space. Some colors pass almost unchanged, others are bitten into by specific molecules. When the James Webb Space Telescope divides this light by wavelength, it sees not a smooth band, but a line of peaks and dips, each one a trace of a gas in the alien sky. Earlier observatories with smaller mirrors and warmer instruments could catch this pattern only on the largest, hottest planets and only in broad outline. The subtler features around cooler, dimmer stars remained hidden in noise. Webb's large gold-coated mirror gathers more light, and its instruments are chilled until their own glow nearly vanishes. It looks in the infrared where red dwarf stars emit much of their energy and where many molecules leave clear marks. Transmission spectroscopy, once a fragile experiment, becomes a main path inward, turning a slight dip in brightness into a map of gases around a world that no human eye will ever resolve. For the small planet in Leo, the observing plan is careful. The world is just over twice as wide as Earth, with a low density that suggests a deep envelope of gas. The host star is cool and relatively quiet. The year lasts about 33 days, so transits come often. If a sub-Neptune hides an ocean beneath hydrogen, this target may reveal it. Months later, far from weather and scattered light, the telescope turns toward Leo and waits for the first crossing. The star's brightness declines by a small fraction and rises again, while Webb's spectrographs count photons at hundreds of wavelengths. Only when scientists on Earth combine hours of data do the outlines of the spectrum become clear. Methane stands out with broad dark bands. Carbon dioxide leaves deep narrow troughs. Water vapor smooths the continuum into rounded valleys. These features match what older instruments suggested, confirming a warm hydrogen-dominated sky. Yet in the region between about 4 and 5 microns, extra sharper dips appear. They are not large, but they recur in a pattern that does not belong to any simple mix of the usual gases. Doubt comes first. Instrument teams comb through calibration files and reference observations, searching for reflections, detector quirks, or software choices that could draw false lines across the spectrum. Independent analysis groups repeat the reductions with different assumptions about background noise and the small motions of the observatory. If the oddities are born of method, they should change when the method changes. They do not. The same fine structure remains. Even so, no one trusts a single transit. A patch of active star surface or a quiet flare could pass unnoticed in total brightness while still altering the detailed spectrum. To press beyond that doubt, the team secures another transit with a different spectrograph on the same telescope, one that covers overlapping wavelengths with separate optics and sensors. The second crossing repeats the geometry almost exactly. Again, the planet moves over the stellar disk, and a thin shell of air filters the star's light. This time the photons fall on different detectors and flow through their own chain of corrections. When the new spectrum is laid over the first, the narrow features in the 4 to 5 micron range line up. Their depths and positions agree within the expected uncertainties. Two different instruments rarely invent the same false signal by chance. Formal fits begin. Models of a simple atmosphere with only hydrogen, methane, carbon dioxide, and water are tested against the data and found wanting at the suspicious wavelengths. When small amounts of sulfur-bearing molecules are added, the match improves. Statistical measures translate this gain into a confidence level of about 99 7/10%, often called 3 sigma. It is not the 5 sigma threshold set for bold claims, but it is far beyond the realm of idle suggestion. At this point, chemistry begins to guide imagination. Laboratory spectra collected on Earth show that dimethyl sulfide and its close cousin dimethyl disulfide absorb strongly in the region where the unexplained dips appear. Seeing hints of them at parts per million levels in the upper air of a distant planet implies that something is replacing them as fast as they are destroyed. On Earth, that something is life in the ocean. Elsewhere, it might be a chain of reactions in a high-pressure magma ocean or a photochemical cycle not yet imagined. The data do not say which. They only insist that this atmosphere is not simple, that a world more than 100 light-years away carries short-lived molecules in surprising abundance. Around desks and screens far beneath the quiet orbit of the telescope, minds begin to lean toward that distant system drawn by a spectrum that feels less like a flat measurement and more like a message, even if its sender and its meaning remain unknown. Long before any light from the red dwarf in Leo reached the mirror of the space telescope, the same fragile sulfur molecules were already rising and vanishing in the skies of Earth. Along coasts and open oceans, across cold polar waters and warm tropical seas, microscopic algae and bacteria drift in the upper layers, turning sunlight and dissolved nutrients into living tissue. Inside their tiny cells, chemistry unfolds that has been refined by evolution across hundreds of millions of years. One of the byproducts of that chemistry is a compound built from carbon, hydrogen, and sulfur that helps these organisms cope with salt pressure and changing conditions in the water. When the cells are damaged, consumed, or decomposed, that compound breaks apart, and one of the fragments escaping into the air is dimethyl sulfide. It is light enough to evaporate from the sea surface and volatile enough to spread far from where it formed. In seaside air, it gives rise to a faint, sharp smell that many associate with tides and distant storms, a sensory reminder that the boundary between ocean and sky is threaded with invisible exchanges. In the atmosphere above Earth, dimethyl sulfide does not last long. Sunlight shatters it, oxygen strips electrons from it, and reactive fragments of water known as radicals tear it into simpler pieces. Within a few days, most of it has either broken down entirely or turned into new sulfur-bearing compounds that seed clouds and influence the brightness of the planet. The short lifetime means that its continued presence in measurable amounts requires constant renewal from below. If the oceans were suddenly emptied of plankton and their bacterial partners, the trace of dimethyl sulfide would fade quickly from the air, leaving only more stable gases behind. That close link between ongoing biological activity and atmospheric concentration has made the molecule a candidate biomarker in theoretical work for years, a kind of chemical whisper that life is busily reforming on the surface faster than sunlight and air can unmake its products. Because the molecule is destroyed so swiftly, its abundance in any atmosphere is a balance between how fast it is created and how fast it is consumed or broken. On modern Earth, that balance settles at values measured in parts per billion tiny against the overwhelming presence of nitrogen and oxygen. To find it at parts per million, as models for the distant planets suggest, requires either a much slower rate of destruction, a much faster rate of production, or some mixture of both. That simple arithmetic drives researchers to look more carefully at what an atmosphere dominated by hydrogen and bathed in the cooler light of a red dwarf might do to sulfur chemistry. Hydrogen does not attack dimethyl sulfide the way oxygen does. Water vapor behaves differently at high pressures. The lighting of the sky shifts toward red and infrared, changing which bonds are most often broken. Even before life has considered the physics of this different air promises to stretch intuition shaped by a blue planet under a yellow sun. In laboratories on Earth, glass cells and steel chambers are filled with mixtures of hydrogen, methane, carbon dioxide, and sulfur-bearing gases then exposed to artificial starlight. The goal is to see whether dimethyl sulfide can be built in meaningful quantities without cells. It can, but only in small amounts. Reactions driven purely by light and heat tend to wander, making many different molecules at once and favoring the simplest ones unless conditions are tuned with care. Trace amounts of dimethyl sulfide and related compounds do appear in such experiments, hinting that non-biological paths are not impossible, yet their concentrations mirror the low levels seen on Earth rather than the far stronger signature inferred for the ocean world in Leo. Scaling those results up to match the observations would require a planet reshaped into an almost continuous chemical reactor venting and irradiating sulfur at extreme rates. Some models attempt this and find that they come close, but rarely all the way, leaving a gap that biology fills easily in concept, if not yet in proof. While chemists pursue these scenarios under lamps and in reaction codes, others turn to the climate of that distant world. A hydrogen-rich sky with methane and carbon dioxide acts as a powerful blanket trapping heat even around a cool star. If the atmosphere's deep surface pressures could rise to hundreds of times those on Earth, changing the very state of water into superheated phases that are neither familiar liquid nor simple vapor. In some ranges of pressure and temperature, water can still remain genuinely liquid, draped across rock like a global ocean. To understand where this planet might sit on that diagram, scientists combine its measured radius and mass to infer its density. The numbers point between rock and ice, suggestive of a large core wrapped in volatile material, neither an Earth double nor a Neptune twin, but something in between. In this regime, small changes in composition shift outcomes drastically. A little more hydrogen tips the surface toward boiling depths. A little less leaves a milder sea that could in principle host chemistry like that found on Earth. If such an ocean exists, it would lie under many tens or even hundreds of kilometers of air in dim light filtered by thick clouds. Energy would reach it both from above and from within as the planet slowly releases heat left over from its formation and from ongoing radioactive decay in its interior. Tidal forces from its close orbit around the red dwarf would knead its interior, stirring the mantle and driving volcanic activity. Hydrothermal vents could spew minerals into the deep, much as they do on Earth's seafloor, creating gradients of temperature and chemistry that many origin of life theories find promising. In that imagined darkness, cells using hydrogen and carbon dioxide as fuel could thrive, exhaling methane sulfur compounds and other gases into the ocean above. Slow circulation would carry their waste upward until it reached heights where molecules could escape into the atmosphere and begin to leave their mark in the spectrum captured by Webb. Back on Earth, the link between oceanic microbes and atmospheric dimethyl sulfide is not mere theory. Ship-based campaigns have trailed plumes of the gas downwind of phytoplankton blooms, tracing how concentrations rise where surface waters teem with life and fall where the sea is barren. Satellite maps show correlations between ocean color, a sign of chlorophyll, and sulfur containing aerosols in the air. Climate models that include this feedback loop find that clouds over busy biological regions form differently, slightly brightening those parts of the planet. It is an elegant circle in which life influences the reflectivity of its own environment through the chemistry of a single fragile molecule. When modelers now take that same molecule and plant it in the atmosphere of a sub-Neptune, they carry with it this long-measured history, aware that they may be exporting assumptions that only hold true for one world. Still, the resemblance between prediction and observation is hard to ignore. The patterns in the data from LEO align too well with curves drawn years earlier in papers exploring hypothetical ocean planets. A sketch from theory has met its match in reality, and the overlap carves out a bay of possibility in the vast sea of explanations, a place where life becomes not the only answer, but suddenly the most straightforward one to imagine. Around the dim red star in Leo, the suspected ocean world traces its path with regular, relentless precision, moving through space at a distance that would roast Earth, yet leaves this heavier planet balanced on the knife edge between inferno and deep freeze. The host star is a red dwarf, smaller and cooler than the Sun, glowing with a steady, ruddy light that peaks in infrared wavelengths. Its surface temperature sits thousands of degrees lower than that of the Sun, and its radius is less than half, so the total energy it releases is far weaker. To receive something like the warmth that Earth feels, a planet must huddle close, hugging the star in an orbit that completes in a little more than 33 Earth days. That is what this world does, circling at a distance of only a few tens of millions of kilometers, bathed in a constant glow that never grows as fierce as noon on Earth, yet never falls to the faintness of Jupiter's realm. The region where liquid water could exist on any planet with a suitable atmosphere, the so-called habitable zone, lies tight around such a star, a narrow ring pulled close to the source of light and heat. The planet in question moves within that ring, though its exact position on the scale of too warm versus too cold depends on how much gas it carries and how that gas responds to the light that falls upon it. Into this already sensitive arrangement comes another complication. The orbit is not a perfect circle. Small deviations in the timing and shape of the transit signals show that the path is slightly stretched, an ellipse rather than a ring, with an eccentricity larger than that of Earth by several factors. At one point in each orbit, the world moves a little closer to its star, and at the opposite point it drifts a little farther away. The difference in distance is not enormous on paper, but light does not fade linearly with distance. It follows the inverse square law, meaning that being 12% closer yields roughly 40% more energy. Over the course of 33 days, the planet therefore swings through a cycle in which the power of starlight at its top atmosphere rises and falls by nearly half a deep cosmic season, compressed into a timescale closer to a human month than a year. Climate models fed with these parameters produce restless worlds. At closest approach to the substellar hemisphere, the side facing the star is driven to higher temperatures. The atmosphere expands and cloud patterns shift. At the farthest point, everything contracts and cools. If the atmosphere is thin, surface temperatures could lurch back and forth across the limits, where water can remain liquid, forcing any oceans to freeze and thaw in jagged pulses. If the atmosphere is thick, its ability to store heat like a vast thermal reservoir could damp these swings, leaving the surface under slower, gentler variations, while the upper air bears the brunt of the cycle. The hydrogen-rich composition inferred for this planet amplifies that buffering effect, because dense hydrogen at high pressure can hold enormous amounts of heat, even though individual hydrogen molecules do not absorb infrared light as strongly as carbon dioxide or water. Close proximity to the star also brings tidal forces that tug unevenly across the planet's diameter, pulling more strongly on the near side than on the far side. Over millions of years, these tides act as a brake on rotation, bleeding spin energy away as internal friction. For a world as near to its star as this one, the probable outcome is tidal locking, a state in which one hemisphere always presents the same face to the star, while the opposite hemisphere lies in permanent night. The planet then resembles the Moon with respect to Earth, but on a far larger and more dynamic scale. On the day side, the star never sets. At the point directly under the starlight falls from the same place in the sky without moving, and heat accumulates. On the night side, darkness stretches forever, broken only by the faint reflected light from the star on any potential moons, or by glow from the planet's own atmosphere. In between lies a band of twilight encircling the globe, a region where the star sits perpetually near the horizon, casting a copper-colored dusk. Early work on such worlds suggested extreme temperature contrasts between day and night, but more advanced simulations, including the effects of a deep-moving atmosphere and possibly of an underlying ocean, show that winds and currents can redistribute heat, softening the extremes. Air heated on the day, face rises, flows toward the night side at high altitude, cools and descends, then returns along the surface as a river of wind. If the atmosphere is massive and circulation strong, this slow global engine can keep the night side above the freezing point of water while preventing the day side from boiling entirely away. In some runs, the most temperate conditions appear not exactly along the twilight circle, but in broad patches offset by the complex interaction of rotation radiation and flow strange climates that have no direct counterpart on any familiar planet. The dimethyl sulfide signature, if real, must be threaded through this restless pattern. Molecules that form near the surface in warm, illuminated waters would be carried upward and sideways by convection, their lifetime stretched or shortened, depending on where in the circulation they travel. Near the substellar point, intense radiation and higher temperatures could destroy them quickly, demanding greater biological or chemical production below to maintain a steady column abundance. Toward the night side, destruction would slow in the absence of strong ultraviolet light, allowing concentrations to build until they are limited, instead by how much material reaches those regions from the source zones. Integrated over the entire limb that the telescope sees, all of these strands of atmosphere contribute to the measured spectrum. The presence of a clear, strong signal at parts per million hints not only at active chemistry, but at a world whose climate has reached a long-lived balance between violent driving and stabilizing feedbacks, An unstable system that swings too far toward boiling or freezing would not support the continuous cycling needed to maintain such delicate molecules over geological time. Thus, in a quiet way, the sulfur lines say something not only about current conditions, but about history. They imply that this planet may have spent billions of years in a regime where oceans, if they exist, did not vanish into space or sink forever into ice, but instead remained available for chemistry to work upon. The red dwarf itself, though prone to flares in youth, has aged into a calmer phase, its most destructive outbursts less frequent, its radiation less likely to strip whole atmospheres from nearby worlds. A star like that, coupled with a planet large enough to cling to its gases and thick enough in its air to even out storms, sketches a setting where the improbable can become routine, where complex molecules form, are broken and form again, under a red sun on a schedule set not by days and nights, but by a dance between orbit spin and heat flows. Against this backdrop, the appearance of a biomarker candidate takes on a deeper resonance, as though a single tone has surfaced from an orchestra of physical processes tuned over aeons, hinting that some of the energy cycling through this system now passes through living matter before it reaches the sky. The measured size and mass of the ocean world in Leo fix it in a liminal category, too large to be a simple rocky planet, too small to be a true gas giant lodged in the mysterious middle ground astronomers call sub-Neptunes. Transit timing and depth show that its radius is about 2.5 times that of Earth. Subtle shifts in the star's motion read from tiny wobbles in the light reveal a mass several times greater than Earth's, though still far below that of Neptune. From these two numbers, size and weight, comes density, and density is the first blunt tool for guessing what lies inside. Earth has a high density because it is mostly iron and rock, wrapped in only a whisper of gas. Neptune has a low density because it is dominated by volatiles, by water, ammonia, methane, and hydrogen woven into deep layers of fluid and gas. The planet in Leo falls between these extremes. Its average density suggests a structure where rock and metal form a substantial core, but a thick envelope of lighter materials must also be present to puff it up to the observed radius. No direct image shows this structure. It emerges from equations in comparative planetology, yet it forces imagination away from familiar ground. This is not another Earth shifted closer to a red sun. It is something stranger, more heavily buried under sky, its solid parts hidden under immense pressure. Interior models begin with simple stacks. At the bottom, a core of iron and silicate rock, perhaps 3 or 4 times the mass of Earth. Above that, layers of water in exotic forms appear in equations. Under immense pressure, water can behave as high-pressure ice, solid but hot, or as a superionic phase where oxygen atoms form a lattice while hydrogen ions move freely through it, a substance that is neither simple ice nor liquid. Above this may lie a true liquid ocean if pressures and temperatures cross the right curve, and above the ocean the hydrogen and helium envelope detected in the spectrum. Small changes in the thickness of any one layer ripple upward, changing surface conditions from bearably warm to crushingly hot. Deep within the planet, heat from formation and from radioactive decay seeps outward. In some scenarios, this heat keeps the base of the volatile layers molten, sustaining a convecting mantle of slushy, high-pressure ice. In others, it pushes the water-rich layers over the boundary into a global magma ocean where rock itself melts and mixes with volatile elements. Both structures can produce an atmosphere rich in hydrogen, methane, and carbon dioxide, but their implications for habitability and for sulfur chemistry differ sharply. In recent years, theorists have proposed a special class of worlds called Hycean planets, a name that blends hydrogen with ocean. These are sub-Neptunes whose thick hydrogen atmospheres sit above global oceans of liquid water kept warm not only by starlight but also by the greenhouse power of their blankets of gas. Such worlds, they argue, could host life even when they are larger and more massive than Earth because the critical ingredient is not a familiar surface but stable water and energy gradients. In their papers, they draw predicted spectra for Hycean atmospheres showing how methane, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and certain biosignature gases might combine to create distinctive patterns in the infrared. Before any real target offered data, these patterns lived only as model curves, theoretical possibilities. The system in Leo now lays a real spectrum over those predictions, and many lines line up. The mere existence of a planet with the right bulk properties and a hydrogen-rich sky was already encouraging for the Hycean idea. The possible detection of dimethyl sulfide pushes it further because that gas was highlighted by some of the same studies as a likely biosignature on such worlds, one that would accumulate to much higher levels than on Earth due to the slower destruction in hydrogen-dominated air. It is as though a sketch of a coastline in theory has been overlaid on a map from observation and the outlines unexpectedly trace one another. Yet the same density and size can tell a different story. Another set of researchers looks at the same numbers and argues that the planet is more likely to resemble a small Neptune with no temperate water layer at all, only a deep hot mantle of volatile rich fluid above a rocky core. In their simulations, the hydrogen atmosphere and its admixture of methane and carbon dioxide trap so much heat that the interface between gas and deeper materials sits at temperatures where water cannot remain a normal liquid. Instead, the transition leads directly into supercritical water or into molten silicates, a churning ocean of magma that belches gases upward. In this view, the lack of detectable ammonia in the atmosphere becomes a key clue. Ammonia is expected in many hydrogen-rich cooler atmospheres, and its absence here is puzzling if a water ocean lies exposed to the sky. However, if the surface is molten and nitrogen is efficiently absorbed into the magma, then atmospheric ammonia could be naturally suppressed. The same process that makes the world unwelcoming to Earth-style life would also remove a gas that might have otherwise been present, aligning theory with observation in a different way. The argument between ocean and magma is not a mere academic exercise. The source and context of sulfur-bearing molecules depend deeply on which portrait is closer to reality. In a Hycean scenario, dimethyl sulfide rising into the air can be easily linked to microbial ecosystems in the ocean, much as on Earth. In a magma ocean scenario, the same molecule, if present, must be built by non-biological chemistry at volcanic interfaces or by photochemical reactions high in the sky, taking on an entirely different meaning. Both types of worlds can in principle produce complex organic sulfur compounds. Both can feed those compounds into the atmosphere. The spectral signature alone at current sensitivity cannot distinguish whether that sulfur cycle flows through cells or through vents and lightning and light-driven pathways. Thus, the density that reveals so much still leaves a double image. The planet sinks for the moment into a quantum-like state of interpretation, holding two incompatible interiors in parallel inside human understanding: ocean and magma, both possible, each supported by some thread of existing data. Additional measurements might tip the balance. A more precise mass could narrow the range of densities. Observations at longer infrared wavelengths could look for signs of hot, dusty air that might indicate strong volcanic outgassing. Subtle variations in transit timing due to possible neighboring planets might hint at a history of gravitational interactions that would have pumped heat into the interior or stretched the orbit into its present eccentricity. For now, however, the interior remains a hidden stage unseen, and inferred only by how it shapes the thickness of the limb that Webb reads during each transit. The atmosphere becomes both a veil and a window concealing the true structure, while carrying enough clues to keep both main interpretations alive. In this delicate uncertainty, the presence of a possible biomarker sits like a weight on one side of a scale, pulling thought gently toward the ocean picture without quite being heavy enough to pin it down. The planet itself, indifferent to these human debates, continues along its path, its deep layers locked in whatever configuration physics has chosen, while above them, starlight continues to write the same coded spectrum onto every transit, waiting for instruments and ideas to grow sharp enough to read what lies beneath its ambiguous lines. High above the unseen surface, the atmosphere of the planet in Leo behaves as both cloak and crucible, a thick, complex layer where light and chemistry continuously reshape one another. Observations from the Space Telescope show that hydrogen dominates this sky with substantial amounts of methane and carbon dioxide and clear signatures of water vapor. Nitrogen, the quiet background gas on Earth, appears far less prominent here, and ammonia, the simple compound that often betrays nitrogen in hydrogen-rich atmospheres, is strikingly absent within current limits of detection. Threaded through this mixture, if the interpretation holds, are parts per million of dimethyl sulfide or a close sulfur-bearing cousin, a short-lived molecule standing out vividly against this deeper, simpler background. The whole structure is not a static shell, but a vertically layered, sunlight-driven system whose patterns of destruction and supply set the stage for any possible biological or non-biological source. On Earth, the lifetime of dimethyl sulfide in the air is brutally short. Within a day or two, under clear skies, photons from the sun and reactive fragments of water and oxygen, known as radicals, break apart most molecules. The chemistry is swift because the atmosphere is rich in oxidants and because high-energy ultraviolet light is plentiful. In a hydrogen-dominated sky under a cooler red dwarf, these conditions change. Oxygen is scarce, so one of the main lines of attack on dimethyl sulfide weakens. Water vapor and methane absorb some of the most damaging ultraviolet before it can reach lower layers. The star itself emits relatively less radiation at the harshest wavelengths. Photochemical models that incorporate these differences predict that sulfur molecules could survive for many times longer than they do on Earth, lingering not for days, but for tens of days, or even approaching 100 days before they are broken into simpler pieces. Longer lifetime means that a given production rate builds toward a higher steady concentration. In principle, that could help explain why the inferred levels on this distant world so greatly exceed the trace amounts measured in Earth's air. Yet even when lifetimes are stretched, the numbers remain demanding. A molecule that endures for 50 days rather than 2 days still requires a production rate tens or hundreds of times higher to reach parts per million in a massive atmosphere. The models converge on a simple conclusion. Something on or within this planet, whether living ecology or relentless geochemistry, must be feeding sulfur into the sky at a pace that would put Earth's marine biosphere to shame. The vertical structure of the atmosphere adds another layer of complexity. Near the top, thin gases bathed in direct starlight form a photochemical region where molecules are constantly broken, ionized, and recombined. Below, that denser air circulates more like a fluid, with convection and large-scale winds mixing gases over time scales of days to weeks. Still deeper, close to the interface with ocean or magma, temperatures and pressures rise, and chemistry is governed more by contact with liquid or molten phases than by direct interaction with light. dimethyl sulfide rising from an ocean or erupting through vents would begin its journey in these deep layers, then be lofted upward by turbulence and storms. How much of it reaches the heights probed by the telescope depends on the balance between mixing timescales and destruction times. If destruction is too swift, most molecules would die low and leave little mark in the transmission spectrum. The presence of a clear signal hints that mixing is vigorous and that lifetimes are long enough for a meaningful fraction of the sulfur to reach high altitudes before it is transformed. In this way, the delicate lines in the spectrum become indirect evidence for the strength of invisible winds and the depth of atmospheric overturning. The absence of ammonia, though less obvious to the eye than the presence of sulfur lines, cuts just as deeply into the range of possible atmospheric stories. In many hydrogen-rich worlds, particularly gas giants, ammonia arises naturally from the equilibrium between nitrogen, hydrogen, and temperature. It shows strong spectral features that instruments like Webb are well suited to detect. Here those features are missing or far weaker than expected. One school of thought points downward toward a hot interior. If the lower boundary of the atmosphere rests not on an ocean but on a layer of molten silicate rock, nitrogen may dissolve readily into the magma. Laboratory studies of high-temperature melts show that nitrogen can vanish from the gas phase pulled into the liquid like salt into water. Over time, this partitioning would leave the atmosphere poor in nitrogen compounds, naturally explaining the missing ammonia. In that picture, the clean spectrum is a signature not of life, but of an intense hidden furnace under the clouds, one that swallows nitrogen even as it exhales methane, carbon dioxide, and sulfur. Another school of thought imagines a cooler, watery base instead. In this view, ammonia does form, but is immediately drawn into the ocean where it dissolves and is rapidly consumed by chemistry or by organisms. On Earth, certain bacteria gain energy by transforming ammonia into other nitrogen species, effectively scrubbing it from the surrounding fluid. A vast ocean filled with such metabolisms could act as a powerful sink, keeping atmospheric ammonia concentrations far below naive expectations. The same circulation that lifts dimethyl sulfide into the sky would also draw ammonia downward into the water, where it would vanish into cycles of nutrient and waste. Under those conditions, the lack of ammonia in the observed spectrum would not contradict biology, but would instead sit comfortably alongside it, another piece of a consistent but still speculative ecosystem. Methane occupies an ambiguous place in these arguments. It is clearly present at around a percent level high enough to play a major role in the greenhouse effect. Yet methane itself is vulnerable to destruction by ultraviolet light and reactive radicals. To maintain its abundance over billions of years, some steady source must exist. Non-biological explanations include the slow outgassing of primordial methane from the interior or continuous production through water-rock reactions at high temperatures and pressures. Biological explanations invoke methanogen simple organisms that on Earth combine hydrogen and carbon dioxide to exhale methane as a waste product. In a hydrogen-rich ocean, such metabolisms would be energetically favorable. For now, neither camp can claim methane as its own. Its presence is a reminder that several different cycles, not only sulfur, must be balanced and renewed in this atmosphere. Above all of these uncertainties, the hydrogen envelope behaves as an enormous reservoir and shield. Its sheer mass smooths fluctuations, absorbing changes in heat and composition that would cause sharper swings in a thinner sky. At the same time, it mediates the way stellar energy reaches the deeper layers, filtering and redistributing light as it passes. Short wavelengths are intercepted higher up, leaving the lower atmosphere bathed mostly in red and infrared. This gentle reddened glow may be what reaches any putative ocean surface, setting the stage for chemistries and perhaps photosynthetic strategies very different from those that arose under the harsher, bluer light of the young sun. The detection of a volatile, delicate molecule like dimethyl sulfide in such an environment, if confirmed, therefore hints at a world where multiple cycles have found a long-term equilibrium, where the constant bombardment of starlight and the quiet workings of interior heat have together carved out a stable space in which complexity can persist. Whether that complexity is entirely physical or also biological remains the question that hangs unresolved in the thin spectral lines drawn across the transit data. The red dwarf at the center of the system appears from a great distance as a steady ember in the constellation of Leo, but its calm glow hides a restless interior. Red dwarfs are fully convective stars, their hot plasma rising and falling from core to surface in great loops that twist magnetic fields into knots. When those knots snap, energy stored in the tangled fields is released in sudden flares, driving jets of charged particles and bursts of high-energy radiation into surrounding space. In their youth, such stars can erupt with terrifying frequency, subjecting nearby worlds to storms of particles and ultraviolet light. Over time, as rotation slows and magnetic fields weaken, the violence eases but never entirely disappears. This particular star, older than 2 billion years, has passed its most chaotic phase, yet it still breathes in magnetic cycles, its surface fields waxing and waning, its atmosphere occasionally cracking with flares large enough to dwarf anything the sun has released in recorded human history. Any planet orbiting so close must live in constant conversation with this magnetic weather. When a flare erupts, a front of energetic photons reaches the planet almost at once, washing over its dayside atmosphere. Soon afterward, a wave of charged particles arrives, guided and sometimes focused by the planet's own magnetic field if it has one. High in the atmosphere, molecules are ionized, broken, and heated. At the very top, some particles gain enough speed to escape the planet's gravity, entirely a slow, invisible evaporation of gas into space. Over the lifetime of the system, such losses can transform thick atmospheres into thin veils or strip them away altogether. Mars offers a nearby example. Once likely wrapped in a denser blanket of air, it now holds only a tenuous whisper, its ancient atmosphere peeled off by the steady pressure of solar wind after the planet's magnetic field faded. For the planet in Leo, the mere existence of a massive hydrogen-rich atmosphere after billions of years says that loss has not outpaced replenishment. Either gravity and magnetic protection have held firm, or the interior has continued to feed gases upward fast enough to replace what the star takes away. The interplay between stellar ferocity and planetary resilience bears directly on the puzzle of the sulfur lines. Every flare increases the rate at which fragile molecules are destroyed. During and after such events, dimethyl sulfide and similar compounds would be ripped apart faster than usual, their lifetime shortened, their concentrations forced downward, unless production below can surge to compensate. If observations of transits separated by many months always show the same abundance, that stability would hint that whatever process produces the molecules is robust against stellar mood swings. On the other hand, if future spectra reveal changes in sulfur line depth that correlate with recorded flare activity, the atmosphere would be revealed as a responsive dynamic system, its composition trembling in rhythm with the star. In either case, the presence of a clear signal in the data already obtained implies that the planet's atmosphere has not been sterilized or eroded into simplicity by its host. It has endured the star's tantrums long enough to accumulate and maintain complex, volatile species. Beneath the outer layers of gas, a hidden shield may be working. If the planet possesses a molten core of conducting metal convecting as it cools, it could generate a planetary magnetic field. Such a field would carve out a cavity in the stellar wind, a magnetosphere that deflects many of the incoming charged particles. The boundary between stellar and planetary fields would shimmer and shift with changing conditions, but within it the bulk of the atmosphere would be spared the most direct blows. On Earth, the auroral ovals at high latitudes mark places where solar particles leak through along magnetic field lines, exciting atoms and molecules to glow. On the world in Leo, similar curtains of light might dance around magnetic poles beneath a sky forever tinted by hydrogen and methane. No telescope yet built can see such auroras at that distance, but their possibility is folded quietly into the continued survival of the atmosphere. If there is no strong magnetic field, then atmosphere must protect itself by other means. A very thick hydrogen envelope can act as a sacrificial layer, its uppermost regions taking the punishment from flares and winds, while the deeper gases closer to any ocean or magma remain comparatively undisturbed. Hydrogen is light and escapes readily when heated, so the outermost shells may be continually eroded and replenished, a slow outward flow that carries energy away. In this picture, dimethyl sulfide and similar molecules are born far below the level where stellar particles do their worst. They percolate upward through many scale heights of gas, diluted and diffused, and by the time they reach the tenuous upper regions where escape becomes likely, most have already been destroyed by ordinary photochemistry. Their visible signature in transmission spectroscopy would then arise from an intermediate layer, high enough for starlight to pass through tangentially during transit, but low enough that direct stripping by wind is minimal. Over very long time scales, even a protected atmosphere can evolve under the star's gaze. Hydrogen, being the lightest gas, tends to escape more readily than heavier molecules. Each departing atom leaves behind a slightly enriched mix of heavier species. On Earth, this effect is small because hydrogen is rare at the surface. On a hydrogen-rich world, it could eventually alter the balance of gases in the upper atmosphere, affecting how heat is trapped and how light is filtered. In some models, this gradual distillation nudges the climate toward regimes where water is more stable as liquid on or beneath the surface, a slow, stellar-driven tuning that might push a marginally too warm world into a more clement state over billions of years. In others, the loss of hydrogen exposes deeper, less protective layers, making the planet more vulnerable to future flares. The present spectrum offers only a snapshot in this long evolution, a single frame from a film that began before multicellular life arose on Earth and will continue long after present human observers are gone. For any nascent biosphere, the star is both threat and opportunity. High-energy radiation can break molecules apart in ways that thermal chemistry cannot, creating reactive fragments that may assemble into more complex structures. In the upper atmospheres of worlds with methane and nitrogen, such photochemistry can build long chains of carbon and nitrogen that fall as hazes covering the planet in organic dust. On early Earth and on Saturn's moon, Titan such processes have been invoked as potential sources of prebiotic material. On the planet in Leo, the red dwarf's flares may similarly supply a flux of energetic photons that, while hostile to exposed cells at the top of the atmosphere, feed a continuous rain of new compounds into the ocean or magma below. Life, if present, would then be shaped by a balance between destructive and creative forces from above, pressed to adapt to flares while exploiting the chemistry they drive. The detection of a candidate biomarker under such conditions therefore carries a double edge of intrigue. It suggests that a complex atmospheric chemistry has survived a long partnership with an active star maintaining delicate molecules under repeated assaults. It also raises the possibility that those very assaults may have helped spark or sustain the underlying processes that now produce the molecules, whether they involve cells breathing in a dark ocean or reactions at the boundary of molten rock. The red dwarf is not just a background lamp, but an agent in the story, its variable light and wind carving, eroding and sometimes perhaps nurturing the environment of its close companion. The faint sulfur lines recorded by a distant telescope become in this view not just traces of a possible ecology, but echoes of a long negotiation between star and planet one, whose terms remain only partly legible in the spectrum that travels across the void to reach a waiting mirror. If the planet in Leo does carry an ocean beneath its heavy sky, that ocean must shoulder an extraordinary burden. On Earth, dimethyl sulfide in the air is maintained by the diffuse work of countless microscopic organisms spread across vast, mostly low-density waters. Even in regions rich with life, a milliliter of seawater holds on the order of 1 million bacterial cells and a thinner scattering of phytoplankton. These communities, together with the food webs that rise from them, are enough to keep atmospheric dimethyl sulfide hovering at parts per billion. On the distant world, models imply concentrations thousands of times higher, even accounting for a slower rate of destruction in hydrogen air. Simple scaling suggests that if biology is responsible, the ocean would need either far more organisms per unit volume than Earth sees, far more efficient pathways to produce sulfur gases, or a longer atmospheric lifetime than even generous models currently allow, and perhaps all three at once. In this imagined ocean, darkness dominates. The thick hydrogen atmosphere above filters out much of the harsh ultraviolet light that damages complex molecules, but it also dims the total energy reaching the water. Sunlight reddened and softened by the gas penetrates only to modest depths before being absorbed. The bright sunlit layer that on Earth extends for tens of meters may here be compressed to thin glowing skin overlying a deep cool interior. Within that skin, photosynthetic life could adapt to the red and infrared light of the host star using pigments tuned to long wavelengths rather than the green capturing chlorophyll that plants on Earth employ. Below, at greater depths, chemotrophic organisms might dominate, living on chemical gradients provided by the interior. Hydrothermal vents on the seafloor driven by tidal and radiogenic heat could spew hydrogen, methane, and various sulfur compounds into the surrounding water, feeding layered ecosystems that never see the star. Cells in these dim realms might exhale dimethyl sulfide not as an incidental byproduct of salt regulation as on Earth, but as a primary waste product or signal shaped by evolutionary pressures that have no close analog here. The pressure at the base of such an ocean would be crushing by terrestrial standards. Each 10 meters of water on Earth adds about 1 atmosphere of pressure. An ocean tens or hundreds of kilometers deep would therefore impose thousands of atmospheres at its floor. Yet life on Earth has already shown that such numbers are not inherently prohibitive. Microbes and even multicellular animals thrive in trenches where pressures exceed 1,000 times those at the surface. Proteins and cell membranes adapt their structures, subtly altered to remain flexible and functional under compression. On the world in Leo, any organisms would have arisen under these conditions, from the beginning built from the start to endure them. For them, the high-pressure environment would not be an extreme but a baseline. Metabolic rates, enzyme shapes, and even the physical form of cells would be tuned to a world where water behaves slightly differently, where its density and viscosity shift with depth in ways that Earth-based intuition only approximates. If dimethyl sulfide is indeed emerging from such depths, its path upward would pass through layers with changing temperature, composition, and motion. Near hydrothermal vents, hot plumes rich in minerals would carry the gas and other volatiles upward in turbulent columns. As they rise, they cool, mix with surrounding water, and release bubbles that grow as pressure falls. Gases trapped in solution at the bottom would come out more freely closer to the surface, forming rising streams that pierce the upper layers. In regions where the ocean meets the atmosphere, wave breaking and bubble bursting would fling thin films of water into the air, each droplet enclosing a tiny sample of the chemistry below. On Earth, such sea spray transports organic matter and microbes into the sky, seeding clouds and connecting surface life directly to atmospheric processes. On the distant planet, the same mechanisms could inject dimethyl sulfide into the lower atmosphere, from which it would then spread upward and around the globe. Strong winds driven by the day-night temperature contrast and by the elliptical orbit would then smear these local sources into broad belts, smoothing out small-scale variations, but preserving the overall signal. The sheer scale required to sustain parts per million of sulfur gases suggests that if life is involved, it is not a thin film clinging to isolated oases, but a planetary scale phenomenon. One line of speculation envisions an ocean so fertile that every cubic centimeter brims with cells, not at 1,000,000 per milliliter, but perhaps at 1 billion or more densities approaching those found in Earth's richest soils or biofilms. In such a sea, every ray of light and every molecule of nutrient would be captured almost as soon as it appears. Energy would cascade rapidly from simple chemistries into complex ecologies with countless micro-niches defined by depth, temperature, and proximity to vents or currents. The limit on biomass might not be the supply of raw materials, but the ability of heat to escape. Life generates entropy as it runs, and in such abundance even biological activity would contribute measurable warmth to local waters. The mental image is one of a dark, crowded ocean humming with invisible activity, its surface calm under a red sky, while beneath trillions upon trillions of cells quietly harvest energy and exhale gases that drift upward to write faint signatures in the starlight. Another more conservative picture keeps biomass closer to terrestrial levels, but grants the local chemistry a heightened efficiency. On Earth, dimethyl sulfide is often a side path, a way station on the route from more complex sulfur-bearing molecules to fully oxidized forms. The enzymes that shape it are not devoted solely to its production. On another world under different pressures and in a hydrogen-rich environment, evolution might have discovered metabolic schemes that lean more heavily on dimethyl sulfide itself. It could act as a carrier of reducing power, a signaling molecule in dense microbial communities, or a key intermediate in cycles that regenerate essential nutrients. In any of these roles, its production rates per cell could be far higher than in earthly phytoplankton. Coupled with a longer atmospheric lifetime, such pathways might be enough to lift concentrations to the observed levels without invoking impossibly crowded oceans. This line of reasoning acknowledges both the conservatism of physics and the creativity of biology, allowing the same basic elements and rules to be rearranged into unfamiliar yet coherent systems. It is also possible, and a point of active discussion, that no cells at all are required. In some magma ocean scenarios, volcanic interfaces between molten rock and volatile rich layers might sustain networks of reactions that, while complex, remain purely chemical. There, dimethyl sulfide could be formed at hot boundaries where carbon-bearing gases encounter sulfur in the presence of hydrogen, then swept into convective plumes that carry it upward without any help from metabolism. The efficiency of such abiotic factories is still a matter of study. Laboratory experiments and numerical models have not yet shown a clear path to parts per million levels, but the range of possible conditions inside an exoplanet is large, and our experience with high-temperature, high-pressure chemistry is limited. Between the towering productivity implied by a biosphere and the still unproven potential of non-biological reactors lies a spectrum of possibilities that future data will have to winnow. From the vantage point of the telescope, none of these stories can yet be distinguished. All that arrives is light slightly dimmed at precise wavelengths, carrying the integrated imprint of everything happening along the limb of the planet. The dimethyl sulfide candidates, if that is what they are, do not report whether they were once part of a cell membrane, a signaling cascade, or a plume rising from molten rock. They only state that bonds between carbon and sulfur and hydrogen have existed in vast numbers, and that they have been lofted high enough and sustained long enough to catch starlight during transit. The rest is inference layered upon inference, a scaffolding of models rising from a few measured dips. Yet in the careful space between what is known and what is imagined, the potential picture of a deep active ocean world emerges as one of the few that can naturally accommodate the scale and persistence of the signal. Whether that picture is accurate or an artifact of terrestrial bias remains one of the central mysteries that gives this distant unseen sea its hold on human thought. To test how extraordinary the sulfur signal really is, scientists first push biology off the stage and ask what a lifeless universe could do on its own. In laboratories on Earth, sealed reaction chambers recreate some of the conditions thought to prevail high in the atmosphere of the planet in Leo. Hydrogen, methane, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide swirl together at chosen pressures and temperatures while lamps pour out ultraviolet light tuned to resemble the softened spectrum of a red dwarf star. Over time, the gas is drawn off and analyzed. The readouts show that dimethyl sulfide and related molecules can appear without any cell walls or enzymes, built instead from chains of reactions in which fragments carved from methane find sulfur-bearing partners and briefly assemble into the right arrangement of atoms. Nature can write this chemical word without life's alphabet, but in these experiments the new molecules linger at vanishingly low levels, typically parts per billion in the mixture, similar to the trace amounts that Earth's atmosphere holds above its oceans. When researchers try to drive the reactions harder, raising ultraviolet intensity or flooding the chamber with hydrogen sulfide, the web of chemistry thickens in all directions at once. Other sulfur species bloom alongside dimethyl sulfide, and the clean, simple spectrum of a single molecule becomes crowded with overlapping lines. A second line of thought turns downward toward a planet with no ocean at all. In this picture, the sub-Neptune in Leo hides a deep magma ocean, a global layer of molten rock above its core. Volcanic gases bubble up through that melt rich in carbon dioxide, methane, hydrogen sulfide, and water vapor and burst into a dense hydrogen atmosphere. At the fiery interface between rock and sky, temperatures of many hundreds of degrees and high pressures could drive exotic reactions that are difficult to test fully on Earth. Mineral surfaces, metal-rich droplets, and steep gradients in composition all act as catalysts. On our own world, fumaroles and volcanic plumes carry faint traces of complex sulfur-bearing organics, hinting that such environments are capable of more than simple gas release. Scaled up to planetary size and multiplied around a whole globe, such vents could in principle act as a vast non-biological factory for dimethyl sulfide. But to maintain parts per million of a fragile gas, the combined output of all these vents must be enormous, far beyond anything seen on Earth, and that level of outgassing should also imprint the atmosphere with other volcanic fingerprints such as sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide. Current spectra do not show these features strongly. They may be hiding below detection thresholds, but until they are seen, the volcanic solution remains possible only by invoking just the right balance between creation, destruction, and concealment. A third scenario draws its material not from within the planet, but from the far reaches of its system. Comets and icy planetesimals forged in the cold outer regions of planetary nurseries are known to harbor a wide menagerie of organics. The mission that orbited the comet, called 67P, revealed dozens of such molecules, including organosulfur species. If a stream of similar bodies were falling into the atmosphere of the planet in Leo, their ices would vaporize and spill complex chemistry into the air. A heavy and continuous rain of comets could in principle maintain high dimethyl sulfide levels without any ongoing production on or within the planet itself. Yet here too the violence of delivery works against the idea. At the high speeds expected so close to a star impact heating tears fragile molecules apart, only a fraction would survive entry. To compensate, the impact rate must be extreme, delivering enormous masses of cometary material every year, a bombardment that would also scatter dust, thicken the upper atmosphere, and inject other comet-borne molecules such as methanol and hydrogen cyanide. These should leave their own marks in the spectrum. So far they do not stand out. Their absence weakens but does not wholly extinguish the comet hypothesis, pushing it toward the role of minor contributor rather than master architect. Across all of these non-biological paths runs the same pattern. Each can make dimethyl sulfide, yet none easily makes enough in a way that matches what the telescope seems to see without also creating other signals that ought to be visible. In response, the argument for a biological origin does not solidify into certainty, but it shifts in the hierarchy of explanations. A thriving oceanic biosphere could channel energy into a narrow set of chemical routes, raising the abundance of one fragile gas far above the levels that blind chemistry would naturally prefer. On Earth, that kind of selectivity allows dimethyl sulfide made by specific communities of microscopic algae and bacteria to stand out from a broad background of sulfur compounds. Extending that logic outward, a strong, relatively clean dimethyl sulfide signature in a hydrogen-rich atmosphere begins to look less like an accident of minerals and impacts and more like the handiwork of some organized energy-seeking process. Yet caution still frames every conclusion. The spectrum that hints at dimethyl sulfide is drawn from only 2 observing windows, and even a high confidence level leaves room for unexpected physics or unimagined chemistry. New models may yet show how some unusual combination of volcanic flows, atmospheric layering, or external delivery can mimic the signal. For now, the situation resembles a half-solved puzzle laid out under a lamp, where a tentative image of a warm, heavy world with an active sulfur cycle has come into view, but many pieces still lie scattered. In the computer models and data archives where this distant planet now lives inside human understanding, the question of how sure anyone can be about its strange sulfur signal moves quietly to the center. The quoted 99 7/10% confidence is more than a line in a paper. It marks the boundary between noise and pattern, between coincidence and cause. Statisticians and observers probe that boundary by asking how often random fluctuations in the detectors and subtle instabilities in the telescope might conspire to imitate a real atmospheric feature. Random noise will sometimes line up by chance, carving fake dips that resemble true absorption lines. To guard against this, teams build simulated datasets feeding their analysis pipelines with artificial spectra that contain only known gases. By running the same procedures and searching for ghost lines in these controlled cases, they estimate how often their methods would be fooled. 3 sigma, that 99.7% certainty, then means that in only a few out of 1,000 empty trials would something as strong as the supposed dimethyl sulfide pattern appear by accident. History presses against this comfort. Planet hunters and particle physicists alike have learned that even 3 sigma can mislead when systematic errors lurk beneath the surface. A flawed calibration, an unnoticed sensitivity to temperature, a faint reflection inside an instrument, or a mistaken assumption about the star can all push stretches of the spectrum upward or downward in ways that mimic real molecular signatures. For this reason, the community has adopted a sterner standard for transformative claims. In fields where experiments are slow and cannot simply be repeated at will, 5 sigma A confidence level above 99.999% has become a cultural threshold. Below that bar, even the most tantalizing signals remain candidates rather than discoveries. The planet in Leo now inhabits that in-between state. Its possible dimethyl sulfide feature is strong enough to invite attention, but not yet overwhelming enough to sweep away alternative explanations. To move forward, astronomers design new observing campaigns that will collect further transits with altered wavelength coverage and independent calibration strategies. Each fresh data set will either reinforce the sulfur pattern or erode it as a sandcastle holds or collapses under new waves. Securing this observing time is a quiet drama of its own. The James Webb Space Telescope is oversubscribed many times over with far more proposals than available hours. Committees of scientists weigh the wish to follow up hints like the Leo planet against other priorities. The case for more transits rests on a promise that a modest investment of additional hours could in time turn a fragile suggestion into a firm statement about the presence or absence of a potential biomarker on a world more than 100 light years away. While observers negotiate for time, theorists refine their atmospheric models, testing how robust the dimethyl sulfide interpretation really is. They vary temperature profiles, shift cloud heights, and adjust the amounts of methane, carbon dioxide, and water to see whether any plausible mixture of ordinary gases can reproduce the observed dips without invoking sulfur organics. They experiment with vertical mixing rates and with patterns of cool spots and bright regions on the red dwarf's surface because star spots can imprint subtle signatures on a transit spectrum. At the same time, Webb continues its survey of other sub-Neptunes. Their spectra taken with the same instruments build a reference library. If false sulfur-like features appear in many worlds where no such molecules are expected, suspicion will fall back on the hardware or the reduction methods. If instead the sulfur pattern remains unique to the Leo planet, its individuality will support the claim that the signal is not a generic artifact. Past controversies sharpen caution. Claims of fossilized microbes in a Martian meteorite and a phosphine in the clouds of Venus both began as indirect signs of possible life and then softened under further scrutiny. These episodes left a trace in the collective mind of the community and awareness that complex remote biosignatures are fertile ground for false positives. In discussions about the Leo planet, such lessons are never far away. Researchers stress that even a confirmed detection of dimethyl sulfide would not on its own prove life, but would instead mark the beginning of a deeper investigation into the planet's chemical and physical context. The path from a first hint in a spectrum to a widely accepted claim about alien biology is not a leap but a series of careful steps. Independent teams must reanalyze the raw data. Additional instruments either on Webb or on future observatories should see the same features at other wavelengths. Complementary measurements such as searches for associated gases or for thermal emission from the planet's night side can help build a fuller picture of its climate and chemistry. Slowly, as each piece falls into place, the hypothesis that a large stable source of dimethyl sulfide exists in the atmosphere moves from imaginative edge toward the center of plausible explanations. At any stage, however, a contradictory observation, a new model that reproduces the data without life, or a reassessment of instrument behavior could tilt the balance back. For now, the story remains poised. The spectrum is published and dissected, its fine structure traced and retraced by many hands. The planet continues on its orbit indifferent, its next transits already set whether or not any mirror turns to watch them, while faint sulfur lines, tiny modulations in the flow of light tug imagination toward a small patch of sky where statistics and the possibility of life elsewhere have become closely entwined. The effort to understand the Leo planet does not stop at the narrow window of transmission spectra. Astronomers now search every way the world can imprint its character on starlight, knowing that each technique samples a different slice of its environment. When the planet passes behind its star in a secondary eclipse, the combined glow of star and planet drops by a tiny amount, as the planet's own thermal and reflected light are briefly removed. By measuring the star's brightness before, during, and after this event, at many wavelengths, observers estimate the temperature of the day side and infer how efficiently heat is transported toward the permanent night. A bare rock with a thin atmosphere would cool quickly and show a stark contrast between day and night. A sub-Neptune wrapped in a deep envelope of gas and perhaps lying above an ocean would instead radiate more evenly its thick air, smoothing extremes. Even coarse eclipse measurements can tell whether the dayside bakes near the boiling point of water or glows with a more moderate warmth compatible with liquid beneath the clouds. Another tool phase curve monitoring follows the planet through its orbit, watching how the combined light of star and planet changes as different portions of the illuminated hemisphere rotate into view. From these gentle rises and falls, models extract rough maps of brightness as a function of longitude weather charts drawn from flickers of infrared light. Hot spots that trail or lead the substellar point reveal how winds drag heat eastward or westward. Broad plateaus of nearly constant emission hint at strong circulation that redistributes energy efficiently. For the Leo planet, a phase curve with only a small difference between brightest and dimmest phases would support the case for a massive, well-mixed atmosphere in which molecules like dimethyl sulfide can be carried swiftly around the globe before they are destroyed. A sharper contrast would point toward a more weakly coupled system, perhaps with a hotter, drier dayside and a colder, less active nightside conditions less favorable for a global sulfur cycle. Thermal emission spectra obtained when the planet is not in transit but simply glowing in infrared against the dark provide a further view. Where transmission emphasizes the limb, the thin ring of atmosphere around the edge emission sees closer to the dayside photosphere, the level from which most infrared photons escape. Gases that are minor players at the limb may dominate deeper down, and cloud decks almost transparent from the side can become opaque from above. By comparing emission and transmission data, scientists begin to outline a three-dimensional picture of how temperature and composition vary with height and location. In such a reconstruction, dimethyl sulfide would not be a single global number, but a vertical profile, perhaps concentrated in a band of altitudes, where it is both supplied from below and sheltered from radiation above. If emission spectra show strong signatures of water and methane, but weak or absent signs of sulfur organics, that would suggest the molecules live mainly higher up, consistent with production in an ocean and gradual lofting. If sulfur features appear stronger in emission than in transmission, a deeper source closer to a hot interior would be favored. Clouds, long a source of frustration in planetary spectroscopy, sit at the center of these questions. Thick clouds can flatten spectral features, muting the fingerprints of gases and making composition harder to discern. At the same time, they regulate climate-reflecting starlight and trapping infrared radiation in a balance that can keep surfaces within habitable ranges. On the Leo planet, high clouds of water, methane, or more exotic condensates such as hydrocarbons or sulfides could ride above a deeper, warmer atmosphere, their tops acting as the effective radiating surface. In some Hycean models, clouds are essential to habitability, raising the reflectivity of the planet enough to prevent runaway greenhouse heating beneath a hydrogen blanket. The pattern and thickness of clouds also influence how gases like dimethyl sulfide are transported. In regions of strong convection, updrafts can punch through cloud layers, carrying trace gases rapidly towards space. In more stable zones, stacked clouds can trap molecules below, altering their lifetimes and the heights at which they contribute most strongly to observed spectra. Every new observational angle thus adds another layer to the planet's portrait, but also opens fresh avenues for ambiguity. A moderate dayside temperature could arise from either an ocean world with effective climate regulation or a drier world with different composition. A muted phase curve might signal efficient winds, or simply a thick uniform haze hiding contrasts. Emission spectra might be reshaped by temperature inversions, where certain layers are warmer than those below. In this tangle of possibilities, the candidate sulfur lines become one thread among many woven through constraints from heat patterns, cloud behavior, and global circulation. As more data accumulate, the range of allowed pictures is likely to narrow toward a family of solutions that all share certain traits: a thick mixing atmosphere, a long-lived reservoir of sulfur, and a climate that has avoided both total freeze and complete boil for billions of years. Within that family, some members will include life and some will not. The work ahead lies in learning which subtle combinations of heat, light, and chemistry are so unlikely in a dead world that invoking biology becomes not a leap into speculation, but the most economical way to explain the whisper of an alien sea carried faintly in the starlight. As the portrait of the Leo planet grows more detailed in codes and spectra, its meaning ripples outward into the broader quest to find life beyond Earth. For decades, the search focused largely on worlds that looked roughly familiar, small rocky planets in gentle orbits around stars like the Sun. Hycean candidates and sub-Neptunes like this one redraw that map, extending habitability into domains once dismissed as too strange. A world more than twice Earth's radius, wrapped in hydrogen, and perhaps hiding an ocean under crushing pressure, was not the original image of a life-bearing planet. Yet the physics of climate and chemistry do not bend to nostalgia. If stable energy gradients, liquid water, and long timescales can coexist in this unusual setting, then the range of possible abodes for biology expands dramatically. Around red dwarfs in particular, where small planets close in are common, the class of sub-Neptunes may outnumber Earth-sized worlds. If even a fraction of them can support deep oceans regulated by clouds and hydrogen blankets, the galaxy's inventory of potential habitats quietly multiplies. The question then shifts from where life might be to what forms it might take under such alien skies. On Earth, the rise of complex multicellular organisms is intertwined with the history of oxygen, a powerful oxidant that allows cells to extract large amounts of energy from food. In a hydrogen-dominated atmosphere, free oxygen would be scarce, quickly reacting away. Instead, metabolic pathways would likely center on redox pairs built from hydrogen, methane, carbon dioxide, and sulfur compounds. Energy yields per reaction might be lower, favoring microbial mats and colonies over large energy-hungry bodies. Life could remain predominantly microscopic, yet still reshape its environment profoundly, much as Earth's bacteria did long before animals appeared. Dimethyl sulfide itself, if biological, would be one sign of such environmental engineering, a molecule that links the deep chemistry of cells to the behavior of clouds, and perhaps to the stability of climate. Under a red star with no clear day-night cycle and seasons compressed into an orbital month, circadian rhythms and familiar ecological patterns would give way to different temporal structures. Organisms might tune their activity to slow oscillations in stellar output, to tidal stresses, or to cycles of nutrient upwelling in the ocean, all playing out under a permanent dawn or unending afternoon. Even if life on the Leo planet is limited to simple cells, its existence would still answer one of the oldest questions in science. It would show that biology can arise more than once under conditions far removed from those on Earth. It would demonstrate that life is not an improbable fluke of a single planet, but a process that the universe runs wherever chemistry and physics allow. That realization would echo back onto interpretations of Earth's own history. The early appearance of life in Earth's rocks only a few 100 million years after the planet cooled would no longer seem a lucky accident, but a manifestation of a broader tendency. Conversely, if future observations erode the sulfur signal and reveal that blind chemistry and hidden interiors can mimic even such specific biomarkers, the lesson would also be sharp. It would warn that the cosmos can produce false positives with ease, that life may be rarer than hoped, or at least harder to distinguish from the output of complex but non-living systems. Either outcome would refine the search, teaching observers which signatures are truly diagnostic and which are shared between biology and geology. In this light, the Leo planet becomes a proving ground for methods as much as a candidate in its own right. The same techniques of transmission spectroscopy, phase, curve analysis, and atmospheric modeling will be applied to many other worlds. Some will show simpler skies dominated by hydrogen and methane. Others may reveal carbon dioxide and nitrogen atmospheres more reminiscent of Earth and Venus. A few may surprise with exotic combinations shaped by tidal heating, frozen surfaces, or deep hazes. Among them, patterns will emerge. If dimethyl sulfide or similar sulfur organics appear only in a subset of planets that also show other hallmarks of habitability, such as temperate climates and possible oceans, their standing as biosignatures will strengthen. If instead such molecules turn up in hot, clearly uninhabitable environments, then non-biological production must be powerful and common, and interpretations will shift. Long lists of exoplanet spectra, each one a thin graph of light against wavelength, will eventually function like a comparative zoology of worlds, revealing which traits cluster together and which stand alone. The tools now in space are only the first generation capable of touching these questions. Concepts for future observatories already contemplate even larger mirrors and more sensitive instruments, some designed to block out starlight directly and see planets in reflected light rather than only in transit or eclipse. Direct imaging of sub-Neptunes and Hycean candidates would open another channel of information showing their colors, and in time tracking patchy cloud systems and possible surface glints that might betray oceans. Interferometric arrays spread across space could in principle resolve thermal patterns on their day sides, mapping hotspots and cool regions with far finer detail than phase curves alone. Each step would add dimensionality to the picture of the Leo planet and others like it, turning them from single lines on a plot into fully realized worlds with weather patterns, seasonal rhythms, and perhaps even stable chemical anomalies that resist any explanation except life. Yet for now, everything reduces back to a few observing windows and a set of careful models. In that limitation lies a certain quiet power. Science here advances not through spectacle, but through the patient refinement of small discrepancies between data and expectation. The planet that orbits unseen around a red dwarf in Leo does not announce itself with radio beacons or artificial lights. It speaks, if it speaks at all, through a slight excess of absorption at particular wavelengths, through a marginally higher brightness at certain orbital phases, through the absence of ammonia where simple chemistry might place it. Human instruments positioned far from their home planet gather these whispers and convert them into numbers. Human minds, drawing on the only example of life they know, and on the broad, impartial laws of physics and chemistry, try to decide whether those numbers are best understood as the breath of cells in a deep ocean or as the exhalations of stone and fire. And the answer remains beyond reach for the moment, but the mere fact that the question can be posed with such specificity marks a turning point. The universe is no longer a distant backdrop of anonymous lights. Piece by piece, it is resolving into individual worlds, each with its own hidden story, and among them, this heavy, possibly ocean-bearing planet in Leo now stands as one of the first where that story might include the quiet collective work of life. In quiet databases and on glowing screens, the planet in Leo is not just an individual case, but a turning point in how distant worlds are judged. For a long span, the search for life beyond Earth leaned on simple markers: liquid water at the surface, a temperate orbit, an atmosphere that did not immediately strip away. Worlds were ranked on checklists sorted by how closely they resembled a narrow picture drawn from the early solar system. The suspected dimethyl sulfide on this sub-Neptune bends that frame outward. Here is a world larger than Earth, wrapped in hydrogen, circling a red dwarf, perhaps with oceans buried beneath pressures no ship could endure, and yet it stands among the most promising candidates for a chemical hint of biology. The language of habitability begins to shift from single factors to patterns, from the location of a planet alone to the intertwined dance of star-type, interior structure, atmosphere, and time. Astronomers begin to speak less of a habitable zone and more of a habitable phase space, a broad region in which many different combinations of conditions might allow chemistry to cross into life. In this broader picture, the Leo planet sits where several interesting axes intersect. Its star is small and long-lived, offering stability across spans far beyond the life of the Sun. Its orbit lies close enough for water, if present, to remain warm, yet not so close that the atmosphere obviously boils away. Its mass and radius suggest a deep reservoir of volatiles above a solid or at least denser core, a configuration that can host either oceans or magma layers. Its atmosphere, as far as present data reveal, is neither a simple hydrogen-helium mix nor a thin eroded shroud, but a layered structure where methane, carbon dioxide, and water all play important roles. Into this complexity comes the faint signature of a fragile sulfur-bearing molecule that on Earth is tied tightly to living seas. No single feature is decisive. Taken together, they create a profile that stands out against the growing catalog of exoplanets, a point of high interest in a cloud of more ordinary cases. To navigate such cases, researchers refine their hierarchy of biosignatures. At the base lie broad conditions that make life possible: in principle, the presence of liquid solvent sources of energy and elements such as carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Above that stand environmental signs that hint at ongoing chemical disequilibrium, such as a mix of gases that would ordinarily react away quickly if not replenished. Higher still are specific molecules that in known settings arise mainly or only through biology. Oxygen and methane together in an Earth-like atmosphere form one such combination hard to maintain at high levels without photosynthesis and metabolism. Dimethyl sulfide in the context of a Heysian model occupies a similar upper tier because on Earth its confirmed large-scale source is life in the ocean, and because its short atmospheric lifetime demands constant renewal. Yet, as the Leo planet shows, even top-tier candidates must be evaluated against the full physical state of the world on which they appear. Spectra alone cannot ignore the possibility that unusual rock heat and light can counterfeit the chemical handwriting of cells. The work of separating genuine biological signatures from clever mimicry draws in many disciplines. Planetary scientists examine how high-pressure ices and silicate mantles behave, asking whether deep convection and partial melting could sustain persistent non-biological cycles of sulfur gases. Stellar physicists model the long-term evolution of the red dwarf's radiation and winds, testing how often and how strongly the atmosphere has been disturbed. Atmospheric chemists map out intricate networks of reactions in hydrogen-rich air, tracing every plausible path that might build or destroy dimethyl sulfide, dimethyl disulfide, and related species. Biologists, for their part, consider how metabolism might adapt to a planet where oxygen is scarce, pressure is immense, and light comes reddened through a thick sky. On-Earth cells already exploit sulfur compounds in many ways as energy sources near hydrothermal vents, as parts of amino acids in proteins, and as signaling molecules in crowded microbial communities. It is not hard to imagine lineages on another world that lean still more heavily on sulfur chemistry, perhaps elevating dimethyl sulfide from a side product to a central player in their ecological strategies. Human culture, watching from the outside, begins to absorb the possibility that the first strong sign of life elsewhere may come not from an Earth twin, but from a place like this, an unseen globe, its surface never directly imaged, known only through the imprint of its air on a few threads of starlight. There is a certain quiet strangeness in that idea. For most of history, life has meant surfaces, landscapes, and visible forms. Here, if life exists, it would be sensed first as an adjustment in a graph, a slight deepening of lines drawn on a screen. The romance of alien encounters yields to a more patient statistical intimacy in which certainty grows not from a single dramatic event, but from the slow accumulation of consistent measurements and the steady failure of non-biological explanations. The Leo planet thus becomes as much a mirror for human expectation as a target of scientific study, showing how far ideas have traveled from early imaginings of nearby familiar worlds. Yet even as interpretation grows more sophisticated, the core experience remains simple. Telescopes collect light, instruments divide it by wavelength, dips appear at certain colors and not at others. From these details, a story of star, planet, atmosphere, and perhaps life is built, checked, and rebuilt. In the case of the Leo system, that story now includes the possible presence of dimethyl sulfide in quantities far above those seen on Earth, a result that neither fits neatly into present models of sterile worlds, nor yet compels a declaration of biology. It occupies a middle ground of profound uncertainty where every new observation has the power to sway understanding, and where the absence of clear answers is not a failure but the natural sign of a frontier. Around the red dwarf, the planet continues its silent orbit, uninvolved in the interpretations that unfold so far away. In the space between its transits and the arrival of its filtered light at a distant mirror, there is room for many futures, a confirmation that life's chemistry has written itself twice in the galaxy, a humbling demonstration that geology can mimic even subtle biosignatures, or a more complex outcome that blends both. Until those futures arrive, the world in Leo remains what it is now, a small modulation in starlight that has for the first time made the idea of an inhabited ocean under a hydrogen sky feel less like speculation and more like a question that nature might with patience allow to be answered. From the vantage point of deep time, the moment when a faint sulfur signature first appears in the spectrum of the Leo planet is brief, a thin slice in a story that began long before telescopes and will run long after them. The red dwarf has already burned for billions of years, fusing hydrogen into helium in a slow, steady process that will continue for tens of billions more. Around it, a disk of gas and dust once clumped into planets of many sizes. Some early worlds were likely flung outward into cold exile or inward to destruction. The sub-Neptune, now under scrutiny, survived those convulsions, settling into its present orbit, where tides, radiation, and gravity together sculpted its evolution. If an ocean lies beneath its atmosphere, that ocean too has a history, perhaps beginning as ice in the outer disk or condensing from steam as the young planet cooled each phase, leaving its imprint on salinity, on trace elements, and on the starting conditions for later chemistry. The timescales of chemistry and biology are shorter, but still vast. On Earth, simple microbial life appears in the rock record within a few 100 million years of oceans forming, while more complex cells and multicellular forms take billions of years to arise. If analogous processes unfolded in the hidden ocean of the Leo planet, there has been time for many outcomes. Life may have sparked early and then stalled at a simple microbial stage or advanced along unfamiliar pathways shaped by high-pressure dim red light and hydrogen-rich air, or never have arisen at all. From the perspective of the present spectrum, these histories would all converge onto similar atmospheric properties unless and until biology began to alter its surroundings in distinctive ways. Dimethyl sulfide, if it proves to be present and to have a biological origin, would then mark the point at which living chemistry became powerful enough to leave a planetary scale trace. In that sense, the candidate biomarker functions as a kind of clock as well as a signpost. It suggests not only that life might exist, but that it has reached a level of collective activity where its waste products circulate through the entire atmospheric system. On Earth, that level was reached when photosynthetic organisms flooded the air with oxygen, transforming the planet's surface conditions. On the Leo world, a similar turning point, if it occurred, might have involved sulfur cycles or hydrogen metabolisms rather than oxygen. The heavy hydrogen atmosphere would swallow free oxygen, quickly reacting it away, so any long-term biological signal must be written in gases that can survive within that envelope while still standing out against purely geochemical backgrounds. Dimethyl sulfide suits that role in theory because it is energetically cheap to make for certain metabolic schemes, yet fragile in the face of photochemistry, a gas that wants to vanish and therefore must be constantly rewritten into the air by ongoing processes. Across the same span of time, the star's activity has changed. Young red dwarfs often flare with brutal intensity, their magnetic fields releasing energy in blasts that can sterilize exposed surfaces and strip atmospheres. As they age, these storms calm. For a world close in, there may be a window when flares are frequent enough to drive interesting chemistry, but not so strong as to erase developing atmospheres or biochemistries. The Leo planet appears old enough that its star has likely passed the fiercest phase, yet still active enough to provide a steady flux of high-energy photons. If life exists there, its earliest chapters might have been written under harsher skies in deep water, or within rock shielded from ultraviolet violence. Only later, as the star softened and the atmosphere stabilized, could gases like dimethyl sulfide safely accumulate aloft. Looking forward, the same star will burn for far longer than the sun. Red dwarfs sip their fuel, their luminosity changing only slowly. If the planet's orbit remains stable and its interior continues to release heat at a gentle rate, the broad outlines of its climate could persist for many tens of billions of years. Oceans, if they exist, might freeze slowly from above or boil away from below, depending on the balance between cooling and radioactive decay, but such changes would unfold over timescales far beyond human generations. On the Leo world, if life has begun, it could have far more time in which to explore possible forms and adapt to slow drifts in conditions. From the human side, however, the window is narrow. The current generation of space telescopes will function for only a few decades. Future observatories will fly or fail based on choices made in a comparatively short period. Civilizations rise and fall much faster than stars, and the continuity of watchfulness they provide is fragile. The next transit of the Leo planet will occur whether any instrument is turned toward it or not. The potential 5 sigma conformation of dimethyl sulfide, the mapping of its phase curves, the detection of complementary gases, all depend on human attention remaining steady. In this way, 2 timescales intersect the almost unchanging background of stellar and planetary evolution, and the brief era during which one technological species happens to be able to notice and interpret faint alterations in starlight. For a little while at least, mirrors and spectrographs exist that can turn the crossing of a distant ocean world in front of its star into a puzzle about life, and what remains to be seen is whether enough light will be gathered and enough care applied to move the Leo planet from intriguing candidate to clearer example of what is possible in the galaxy. On a dark mountain, on a quiet ship's deck, in city apartments where street lights leak through curtains, people still look up and see the same scattered pattern of stars their ancestors saw, unaware that one of those modest points in Leo now carries a new layer of meaning. There is nothing remarkable to the naked eye about that red dwarf. It is too faint to dominate the constellation, too distant to show color. Yet in observatories and control rooms, its catalog number has become shorthand for a chain of ideas that stretches from quantum transitions in sulfur molecules to the possibility of alien biology. The planet that circles it remains invisible even in the largest telescopes, a calculation rather than a disk, a recurring dip in brightness rather than a resolved world. Still in the minds of those who have traced its spectrum and run models of its sky, it has taken on a kind of presence, a steady companion in thought. Conversations about the Leo planet thread through conferences, late-night video calls, and quiet exchanges over email. Some researchers are drawn to the elegance of the Hisian picture, where a deep ocean under hydrogen, stirred by tides and warmed by both star and interior hosts, microbial life that fills the atmosphere with dimethyl sulfide. Others lean toward magma oceans and exotic geochemistry, wary of letting a single Earth-centered analogy dominate interpretation. Many hold both images at once, switching between them as new data or ideas arise. In talks, the planet's possible sulfur signature is often shown alongside curves from laboratory spectra and from previous climate simulations, the lines overlaying until they seem less like coincidence and more like a slowly hardening clue. Yet, at the end of each presentation, slides return to words like candidate, tentative, and to be confirmed, a language of restraint that acknowledges how easily complexity at great distance can mislead. Beyond the technical debates, there is also a quieter personal dimension. For some, the idea that the first credible hint of alien life might come not from a radio beacon or a lander's photograph, but from a fine structure in an infrared spectrum is both surprising and fitting. It aligns with the way much of modern science actually proceeds, not in single dramatic revelations, but in the gradual narrowing of possibilities as data accumulates. The Leo planet becomes a symbol of that process, a case where patience, precision, and cross-discipline collaboration might over years transform an ambiguous graph into the first widely accepted evidence that life has arisen elsewhere. For others, the same possibility carries a subtle melancholy. If life is detected this way, it will be at such a remove that no direct contact, no conversation is possible. The ocean beneath the hydrogen sky will remain forever unvisited, its biochemistry inferred from afar, its landscapes imagined rather than seen. The planet also acts as a test of how human societies respond to ambiguity. No one observation can force a conclusion. Instead, the world presents a sustained, demanding question. Can attention be held long enough to gather the needed data? Can excitement about potential discovery coexist with the discipline required to avoid premature claims? Agencies, universities, and research groups, all subject to budgets and fashions, must choose whether to invest scarce observing time in deep repeated measurements of a single intriguing target, or to spread that time more thinly across many less exotic worlds. In this way, the fate of the dimethyl sulfide investigation depends not only on physics and chemistry, but on the priorities and continuity of a civilization that on cosmic scales has only just learned to use light as a probe. Meanwhile, the universe offers no comment. The red dwarf continues its slow burning. The planet continues its 33-day circuit, its atmosphere rising and falling slightly with tides of heat, its winds and possible clouds moving in patterns no one can see directly. Whatever processes generate sulfur-bearing molecules, whether metabolic or purely geological, continue at their own pace, untroubled by the fact that on a small, distant world, some of that chemistry has been noticed. The light that left the star during one transit is already hundreds of billions of kilometers away, racing outward in a widening sphere. Only a tiny portion was intercepted by the Space Telescope. The rest continues into the dark, carrying the same encoded information past stars that no one has charted in detail through empty regions that will never host observers. In that broader emptiness, the particular alignment required for this investigation is striking. The planet's orbit happens to cross the face of its star from Earth's perspective, allowing transits at all. The star happens to be bright enough in the infrared for Webb's instruments to gather useful data. Humanity happened to develop space telescopes and the necessary spectroscopic methods during the brief historical window when funding, technology, and interest aligned. The ocean world, if that is what it is, happens to be at a distance and under conditions that make its atmosphere both detectable and interesting. None of these coincidences are by themselves miraculous in a vast universe, but together they form a narrow corridor through which information can flow. The corridor leads ultimately to a small set of questions that now hover over the Leo system. Is the planet's interior dominated by water and rock, or by molten silicates and volatile rich fluids? Does a genuine ocean lie beneath the hydrogen? And if so, how deep and how warm is it? Are the sulfur-bearing molecules hinted at in the spectrum produced continuously by some form of metabolism in that ocean, or do they arise from non-living cycles in rock and air pushed into overdrive by unusual conditions Will future observations strengthen the case for biology or uncover alternative chemistries that render even dimethyl sulfide an ambiguous sign? None of these questions can be answered today. Each awaits more light, more careful analysis, more time. For now, the Leo planet stands as a boundary marker between ignorance and knowledge, drawn not in stone but in probabilities. On one side lies a universe where life, while possible, has so far only been confirmed on a single world. On the other lies a universe where life is a repeatable outcome, capable of arising independently under conditions very different from those of Earth. The faint tentative sulfur lines in a few transit spectra do not cross that boundary, but they touch it. They show that with existing tools, the question can be approached in ways that are precise, testable, and rooted in real data. That alone changes the shape of the night sky. Among the countless stars, at least one now carries not just the possibility of planets or of water or of suitable temperatures, but the first serious hint that in an unseen ocean under a red sun, chemistry may have done what it did here long ago, assembled matter into something that uses energy, builds complexity, and leaves in the thin air above it a quiet, persistent trace of its existence.